Jack's ship was in flames. The control panel blinked with a series of red warnings, but none of it made sense to him as his hands fought for control of the ship. He yanked the joystick, desperately trying to steady the ship as it spiraled toward the desert planet below. His breathing was erratic, and sweat coated his forehead. A voice on the intercom screamed something he couldn't understand, but it didn't matter. The ship was falling. The last thing he heard before everything went black was the ominous whine of the engine. When Jack came to, it was the burning sun that hit him first. He groaned, a dry rasp escaping his lips. His head throbbed, and he tried to sit up, only to collapse back against something soft. The air was thick with heat, and his body felt like it was being baked in an oven. He blinked, squinting against the harsh light. His spaceship, what was left of it, was smoking a few yards away. Nothing but twisted metal and broken pieces of tech. His comm link was down, and he had no idea where he was. The radio crackled for a moment, but it was mostly static. Great. He had no one to call. Jack groaned again, trying to push himself upright. He could barely move, his head spun, and his body felt weak. His mouth was dry, like sandpaper on his tongue. He could barely remember the last time he had a proper drink of water. Dehydration was setting in, and fast. He cursed under his breath, looking around for any sign of civilization. Nothing. Just endless dunes stretching to the horizon. Help! Jack whispered to no one in particular, his voice barely audible over the wind. He fumbled through his suit for his emergency ration packs, only to find they had been torn open in the crash. Useless. His vision started to blur, and his thoughts began to turn hazy. How long before he passed out from dehydration? Suddenly, a shadow fell across him. Jack squinted into the sun, trying to focus. It was a figure, tall, and moving with unnatural grace. Jack's pulse quickened, his survival instincts kicking in. Maybe this was his ticket out. But as the figure drew closer, his heart skipped a beat. The figure was a woman, a stunning one at that. She was alien. Definitely not human. Her skin was a soft shade of lavender, and her eyes were enormous, almost unnaturally so. But it wasn't just her features that caught his attention. It was her assets. Her body was exaggeratedly curvy in ways that seemed to defy logic, like something straight out of a dream, or maybe a nightmare. His dehydrated brain couldn't make sense of it. Was he hallucinating? He had to be. She stopped a few feet from him, her expression calm and unreadable. Jack's mind was racing, but his tongue refused to work. He tried to speak, but all he could manage was a strangled cough. His throat was so dry it felt like it might crack. Water! Jack croaked, raising a shaking hand toward her. Please! The alien woman studied him for a moment before tilting her head slightly, a small smile forming on her lips. You need more than water, she said, her voice melodious but somehow distant, like a wind over a distant desert. You need healing. Jack blinked in confusion. Healing? His eyes darted to his surroundings, but there was no sign of any kind of medical facility. What are you? The alien knelt beside him, her long, flowing hair swishing behind her. I am Nara. I can help you, but first, you must trust me. Jack's dehydrated mind didn't know what to make of this. She was beautiful. Too beautiful. The kind of beauty that seemed almost unreal, like something out of a storybook. But it wasn't the time to get lost in thoughts of alien beauty. He needed to survive. He could barely even move. I'll trust you, just give me something to drink. Jack rasped, his voice barely more than a whisper. His head felt like it was swimming in a fog of thirst. Nara's expression softened, almost as if she were amused by his desperation. She reached down and placed a hand gently on his arm, her touch surprisingly cool against his burning skin. Then, with the grace of someone who had done this 1,000 times before, she produced a small vessel from the folds of her garment. Jack watched her, his mouth dry, his heart racing. She wasn't offering him water, though. What she was holding looked strange. A pale, glowing liquid swirled inside, almost iridescent, and Jack blinked, still trying to process the situation. "What is that?" he asked weakly. "I need water." "This will heal you," she said softly. "It is the milk of my people. You will feel better." Jack stared at her. "Your milk?" He was dehydrated, and she was offering him milk? Was this some kind of alien joke? He could barely keep his thoughts straight, but this wasn't what he expected. If anything, it was ridiculous. Yet, the desperation gnawing at him made the decision for him. He needed something, anything. His body was on the verge of collapse. Before he could protest, Nara tilted the vessel toward his mouth. Jack instinctively recoiled, but her grip on him was firm. She spoke again, her tone almost hypnotic. "You must drink, or you will die here." Jack stared at the glowing liquid for a moment longer, then, with a resigned sigh, he opened his mouth and allowed her to pour it in. The moment it touched his tongue, something shifted. A shock of coolness spread through his body, washing away the scorching thirst that had ravaged him for so long. He gulped it down, and suddenly he felt stronger. A warmth spread from his chest to his limbs, and the fog in his head began to clear. His vision focused, his breath steadying. Nara smiled down at him. "You will survive now. But you are far from safe." Jack blinked, still trying to process what had just happened. "I don't even know where I am," he said, still struggling to catch his bearings. "You're an alien, aren't you?" Nara's smile widened, but her eyes held a trace of amusement. "Yes. I am from the nomadic tribes of this planet. But you are far from home, human. It will take more than healing to survive here." Jack stared at her, his mind still spinning. "Yeah, no kidding." He glanced at the wreckage of his ship in the distance. "How long do I have before?" "Before the heat takes you?" she interrupted. "Hours. Maybe less. But with my help you may have a chance." Jack sighed in relief, though his sense of reality was still shaken. "All right. You've saved my life. Now what?" Nara paused for a moment, studying him with a strange, unreadable expression. Then, without any warning, she reached down and gently pulled him to his feet. "Now you will follow me. I will teach you how to survive. And you will owe me a great debt." Jack blinked, still confused, but his body was too weak to argue. Besides, she was the only chance he had. He followed her, stumbling slightly as they made their way across the desert. "So, Jack began, trying to break the tension. "How does this whole healing milk thing work? Is this some kind of weird alien ritual?" Nara glanced at him with an amused smile. "It's a tradition. My people do this for all males who are in need of healing. It is a custom." Jack, still unsure of what to make of all this, couldn't help but chuckle. "Well, I guess I'm glad I crashed on your planet then. Who knew that getting nursed back to life by an alien beauty was a thing?" Nara smiled, but there was a sharpness in her gaze that made Jack pause. "Careful, human," she warned. "My people do not take kindly to jokes about our customs." Jack held up his hands in mock surrender. "No jokes. Got it." But inside, he couldn't help but feel a growing attraction toward the woman who had just saved his life in the most bizarre, awkward way possible. He wasn't sure where this strange journey would lead, but one thing was certain: he wasn't alone anymore. And somehow, that made everything feel a little less hopeless. Jack wiped the sweat from his brow, his body now slightly steadier after drinking Naro's strange milk. The immediate effects were undeniable. His skin felt less parched, his breathing steadier, but the awkwardness hadn't faded. Nara, now walking ahead of him through the endless desert, seemed completely unfazed by everything. To Jack, the whole situation felt like a fever dream, stranded on an alien world, practically saved by the breast milk of a stranger, and now following her through a hostile, unfamiliar landscape. He glanced at her as she moved gracefully ahead. Her movements were fluid, almost hypnotic, and the sway of her hips, impossible to ignore, even in his dehydrated state, only made things worse. She was beautiful, in a way that didn't seem real. Jack tried to shake off the thought but couldn't. He'd seen plenty of attractive women in his time, but this felt different. There was something almost dangerous about her allure. Nara slowed her pace, waiting for him to catch up. Jack, suddenly aware that he'd been trailing behind, cleared his throat. So, can we talk about that milk thing? Not that I'm complaining, he added quickly, wanting to avoid insulting her. But I've got to admit, that's not exactly what I expected when I thought alien rescue. Nara turned to face him, her lips curling into a faint smile. What did you expect? Her voice was calm, almost teasing. Water? Or perhaps some advanced human medical technology? You are on my world now, human. Customs here are not yours. Jack scratched the back of his neck, feeling uncomfortable. Yeah, well, it's just strange. You know, I'm used to, well, normal rescues. Water, food, maybe a first aid kit, not that. Nara's expression didn't change. She stepped closer to him, her eyes narrowing with a slight smirk. My people have lived here for centuries, and we survive by different means than yours. Water is precious here, human. It is not the easiest resource to come by. Jack nodded, his mind still trying to process everything she'd said. Her eyes held no malice, but he could feel the weight of her words. Her people had a connection to this planet, and they clearly knew how to survive in ways that humans might find strange. Okay, fair enough. I get that. But what else? I mean, what am I supposed to do now? I'm just a guy who crashed his ship on your planet. Do I owe you anything? Nara's lips twitched, and she shook her head slowly. You owe me nothing yet. But, she leaned in slightly, her voice dropping. You will owe me if you want to survive. Her gaze flicked over to the horizon where the sun hung low, casting a reddish glow across the landscape. This desert is no place for the weak. If you are to remain here, you must learn. You must adapt. Jack raised an eyebrow. Adapt? To what? The desert? And your customs? How exactly am I supposed to do that? You will learn, she said with a faint chuckle. But first we walk. And you ask questions later. They walked in silence for a while, with Jack stumbling a few steps behind her. His legs were still shaky from the milk, but the overwhelming sense of discomfort lingered in him like an itch he couldn't scratch. His brain was working overtime, processing everything that had happened. First, the crash. Then Nara, who appeared out of nowhere and, unconsciously or not, made his mind race in a way that didn't feel entirely human. Was she flirting with him? Was he imagining it? And then the milk, dear God, the milk. Trying to focus, Jack pushed the thoughts aside. So, he tried again, hoping to break the tension. You said you're from a nomadic tribe, right? How many of you are out here? Nara glanced over her shoulder at him, her gaze measuring. A few hundred. Not all are here on this part of the planet, but we roam. We hunt, we gather, we trade. She paused for a moment, as if unsure whether to share more. You, human, would call it nomadic. We simply call it survival. Jack swallowed the lump in his throat. A few hundred. That wasn't exactly a thriving civilization, but then again, this was a harsh desert. The thought of living in such a way, constantly on the move, scraping by, not knowing where your next meal would come from, sent a shiver through him. Survival, he muttered under his breath. Yeah, I guess that's what we're all doing. You've got it figured out, though. I'm just lucky you found me, I guess. She turned her head slightly, her lips twitching again. Lucky? You are fortunate, yes. But also, clumsy. You nearly killed yourself with your foolishness. Jack opened his mouth to protest, but she raised a hand, silencing him with a stern look. You have no idea what it is like here. The planet is harsh. It will break you if you let it. Jack grumbled, rubbing his neck. Yeah, I'm learning that the hard way. But listen, about that milk thing, there's gotta be more to it than just survival. I mean, that's not exactly something you do for just anyone, right? She chuckled softly, though there was something a bit darker in her voice this time. I do it because it is the way of my people. To heal and sustain those who are in need. And it is also She turned her face towards him, the amusement in her eyes now matched with the coolness that sent a chill through him. A privilege. Jack furrowed his brow. A privilege? He wasn't sure if he was uncomfortable or intrigued, maybe both. So, you're saying I should feel honored or something? Naro's expression softened. It is not about honor. It is about need. My people understand the balance of the world. We give and we take. You survived because I helped you. And perhaps you will return the favor. Jack scratched his chin. Okay. Sure. That makes sense. I guess I'll owe you one. Nara stopped abruptly, her expression turning serious. You owe me nothing yet. But you will, human. She regarded him carefully for a moment, then added in a quieter voice. And perhaps you will want to offer more than just a simple debt. Jack blinked, the weight of her words hanging in the air. He opened his mouth to say something, but Nara didn't give him the chance. She turned and walked ahead again, her gait purposeful. For the next few hours, Jack followed her, the desert stretching on endlessly. The sand seemed to shift underfoot, and the heat was relentless. He couldn't help but notice the slight sway of Nara's hips as she moved ahead, and it only added to the awkward tension building between them. Jack felt like he was on the edge of something, though he wasn't sure what. He was getting used to the rhythm of walking behind her, trying to tune out the thoughts swirling in his head. He tried to focus on the terrain, keeping his mind off of the way Nara seemed to move with such confidence, but it was hard. She was mesmerizing, her beauty undeniable, but it was more than that. It was her self-assuredness. The way she carried herself, like she had been through hell and back, and had emerged unscathed. It only made Jack feel more out of place. Hey, Nara? He ventured again. You ever thought about teaching someone like me how to survive out here? Nara glanced over her shoulder, her lips curling into a teasing smile. You? Learn? I think you still have much to understand about survival, human. But I will teach you, in time. Her eyes glinted with mischief. If you can keep up. Jack sighed, resigned to the fact that his survival depended not just on learning the ways of this alien desert, but on figuring out how to navigate the even more complex terrain of his growing feelings for the woman leading him through it. I guess I'd better keep up then, he muttered under his breath, half joking, but the tension in the air told him he might be in deeper than he realized. The desert was unyielding. Jack's legs burned with each step, and the sand beneath his feet seemed to stretch on forever. He wasn't sure how much longer he could keep going, but Nara had hardly slowed down. Despite the oppressive heat, she moved with ease, her pace unrelenting. Every time Jack tried to get ahead, his body would scream at him to slow down, and she would remain a few steps ahead, watching him with an expression that seemed to mix patience and amusement. So, how much farther? Jack asked, his voice raspy and hoarse from the dry air. Sweat dripped from his brow, but he tried to keep his tone light, as though he wasn't completely exhausted. Nara didn't even look back. Far enough. Her voice was low, almost distant. You need to learn what it takes to survive here. If you don't, it won't matter how far we go. Jack cursed under his breath. Of course, he hadn't expected it to be easy. He hadn't expected much of anything after crashing on an alien planet, but he hadn't thought it would be this brutal. His body felt like it was turning to mush, his stomach growling incessantly, and the hot, suffocating air didn't help. So, when do we get to the part where I don't feel like I'm about to pass out? Jack joked, but his voice lacked the usual humor. It was more a desperate attempt to break the tension that was beginning to feel more oppressive than the desert sun. Nara glanced at him briefly, her face impassive. You should have asked that before you crashed. You are weak. It is a waste of energy to complain now. Jack wanted to snap back at her, but he didn't have the strength. He was just too damn tired. Instead, he pressed his lips together and kept walking, his thoughts turning inward. Despite his thirst, despite his aching muscles, something about Nara's presence kept his mind from focusing on just survival. Her beauty was undeniable, sure, but it was the way she carried herself that both intrigued and frustrated him. There was a confidence in everything she did, a self-sufficiency that Jack couldn't quite understand, and it made him feel more vulnerable than he'd ever felt in his life. They walked in silence for what felt like hours, the oppressive heat of the desert sinking deeper into Jack's skin. His body ached with every step, his throat dry as ever, and his mind was hazy, but he refused to stop. Eventually, they came upon a small rise in the sand dunes, and Nara halted. She stood still for a moment, surveying the landscape ahead, and Jack stopped a few paces behind her, his eyes following the direction of her gaze. "What are we looking at?" Jack asked, though his voice was weak and strained. Nara didn't answer immediately. She just stood there, her eyes scanning the horizon, her posture as rigid as a sentinel. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, she spoke. "There. A shelter." She pointed to a distant cluster of jagged rocks that seemed to shimmer with the heat of the sun. "It's not much, but it will keep us safe for now." Jack let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Safe. The word was a relief, but he wasn't naive enough to think that this meant they were out of danger. No, this was just another stop, another piece of the puzzle in whatever strange journey he'd found himself on. Still, the thought of having some shelter from the desert was more than he could have hoped for at that moment. The two of them made their way toward the rocks, the hot wind whipping against their skin. As they approached, Jack noticed something strange. The rocks weren't just ordinary stone, there was a subtle shimmer to them, almost like they were alive. They weren't solid, but rather translucent in places, glowing faintly with a soft, ethereal light. "What are these?" Jack asked, his curiosity piqued despite his exhaustion. Nara glanced at him, her expression unreadable. "These are the stones of the desert. They store the energy of the planet. At night they will cool, but during the day, they absorb the sun's heat, making the shelter more bearable." Jack raised an eyebrow. "That sounds very convenient." Nara didn't respond to his sarcasm, simply guiding him between the stones and into a small, sheltered alcove. It was much cooler here, and Jack collapsed onto the ground, grateful for the respite. He let out a deep sigh, leaning back against the stone. His body felt heavy, his head foggy, and it was all he could do to stay conscious. The air here was slightly less suffocating, but it still felt like he was being smothered. His throat burned with thirst, and every part of him longed for something cool to drink. He couldn't stop thinking about the milk Nara had given him earlier. It was different, but it had worked. It had healed him. "I should thank you," Jack muttered, still half-dazed. "You know, for saving me. I was pretty close to dying out there." Nara sat across from him, her posture still elegant, though there was a certain softness in her expression now. "You would have died without my help. I do not need your thanks." Jack smirked weakly, glancing up at her. "I'm not sure that's how this works. You can't just save someone's life, throw them in a desert, and expect no gratitude." She raised an eyebrow. "And what else do you think you owe me?" Jack paused, the question catching him off guard. What did he owe her? He had no idea what her culture was like, what her expectations were, or what her motivations truly were. All he knew was that he was alive, and she had played a part in that. But her words hung in the air, as if she were testing him, seeing how far she could push before he cracked. I don't know," Jack admitted. "Maybe I owe you my survival. That's something, right?" Nara's lips quirked upward, a fleeting smile that looked almost like a knowing grin. "You do owe me your survival. But you also owe me your cooperation." Jack frowned. "Cooperation? With what?" Nara leaned forward slightly, her eyes narrowing. "You will stay with me. You will learn to survive. You will help me, in whatever way I see fit. And you will do so willingly." Jack felt a strange chill run down his spine. The intensity of her gaze wasn't just intimidating, it was captivating. There was something undeniably powerful about her, something that made him feel both small and enthralled. "You're asking me to be your partner?" he asked, his voice laced with confusion. Nara didn't hesitate. "Partner? No. You are human. You are weak. But you can be useful." That is what matters here. Jack felt the sting of her words, but part of him couldn't deny that she was right. He wasn't equipped to survive on her planet alone, and he had no other choice but to rely on her. He swallowed the bitterness in his throat and nodded. All right. I'll cooperate. But you've got to give me something to work with. I'm not used to this desert life. Nara stood up and moved toward him, her steps deliberate. I will teach you. But first, you must show me that you are worthy of my time. She reached out and placed her hand on his shoulder, her touch cool against his heated skin. Prove that you can survive, human. And I will show you what else you are capable of. Jack looked up at her, the strange, inexplicable connection between them growing more intense with every word. She wasn't just saving him, she was changing him. And whether he liked it or not, he was beginning to realize that his survival here might depend on much more than just learning the ways of the desert. He wasn't sure where this journey was taking him, but he knew one thing for sure: he wasn't going to get out of this without facing some uncomfortable truths. About Nara. About himself. And maybe, just maybe, about the strange, growing bond between them. The night was colder than Jack had expected. The desert, once unbearably hot, now seemed like a frozen wasteland, the temperature plummeting sharply as the sun disappeared over the horizon. The stones around them absorbed the heat of the day, but it wasn't enough to protect them from the biting chill of the desert night. Jack wrapped his arms around his body, trying to conserve what little warmth he could, but it wasn't long before he heard the sound of Nara moving behind him. She had a fire going, the orange glow casting an eerie light on the rocks surrounding them. Jack had tried to sleep, but his body refused. His mind raced, replaying everything that had happened: the crash, the desert, the strange, intoxicating way Nara had kept him alive, and the bizarre bond they were forming. Every time he thought he was starting to understand the situation, something else threw him off. He couldn't help but think about her, about the way she seemed so completely in control of everything. How did she survive out here? And why was she still helping him? What are you thinking about? Nara's voice cut through the stillness, pulling Jack from his thoughts. He turned to look at her, the firelight casting shadows over her features, making her seem even more mysterious than usual. There was something almost predatory in the way she held herself, like she knew exactly what Jack was feeling but wasn't about to reveal anything about herself. Just trying to wrap my head around all of this, Jack said, his voice rough from the dryness in his throat. You, me, the desert. Everything's just so damn weird. I feel like I'm in a bad sci-fi movie. Nara smirked, her eyes glinting in the firelight. You are on an alien planet, human. This is not a movie. This is reality. Your reality for now. Jack sighed and leaned back against the stone, trying to get comfortable. Yeah, but what is this really? I mean, you've been helping me, you've been kind of nursing me back to life, but for what? What's your end game here? The question hung in the air between them, and Nara didn't immediately answer. Instead, she stood up and walked toward him, her movements smooth and deliberate. End game? She echoed, her tone a little too calm for Jack's liking. You think I have an end game? Perhaps I do. Or perhaps I am simply helping you survive. Jack narrowed his eyes. You're telling me you're doing this out of the goodness of your heart? Nara laughed softly, the sound almost musical in the quiet night. Goodness? You think we, the people of this desert, operate on goodness? No. We operate on necessity. You survived because you were in need. I helped you because I saw no reason to let you die. That is all. Right, Jack said, though he wasn't fully convinced. And I'm just supposed to believe that. I'm some random guy who crashes on your planet, and you just decide to, what? Play nursemaid? Nara's gaze was sharp as she moved even closer, her presence overwhelming. You think too highly of yourself. You are not special. I have helped others before. I have saved many. But you are different. And that, human, is why you are still here. She lowered herself down next to him, her body close but not quite touching his. The desert does not care for your emotions or your questions. The desert only cares for survival. Jack's heartbeat quickened at her proximity, his body reacting in ways he couldn't control. There was something in the air between them, an undeniable chemistry that felt both dangerous and thrilling. He swallowed hard and tried to push the thoughts out of his head. Now wasn't the time for that. He cleared his throat, trying to regain some semblance of control. I get that. But you can't just say you're helping me for survival without some kind of motive, right? Nara's lips curved into a slight smile. Motive? She repeated, almost mockingly. What makes you think I need a motive? Survival is motive enough. But if you must know, there is something I require in return. Jack's breath caught in his throat. His mind raced with a dozen possible explanations, but none of them seemed to make sense. What do you want? She paused for a moment, letting the tension build, before speaking in a voice that was low and almost seductive. You will help me in my travels. You will be my companion. In return, I will teach you more than just survival. I will teach you the ways of my people. Jack looked at her, his eyes narrowing slightly. And what exactly do you mean by that? Nara leaned in, her face only inches from his. I mean, more than just survival. More than just how to walk in the desert, how to gather food, how to find water. I will show you things you cannot even begin to imagine. Jack's mind whirled, and he tried to focus on her words. But the way she was looking at him, the intensity in her gaze, made it hard to think clearly. There was no question that she was more than just a survivor. She was a force. He could feel it in every inch of his body. He didn't know whether to be intimidated or turned on. And what exactly does this training involve? Jack asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Nara's lips curled into a smirk, and she leaned back slightly, almost as though she was savoring the moment. Training? You will see, human. You will learn. But first, you must prove yourself worthy of such lessons. Jack swallowed, his throat still dry, his body screaming for relief. Prove myself worthy? How? Nara's eyes glinted with mischief, and she stood up, walking a few paces away. You will prove yourself by your actions. By your strength, your resilience, and your willingness to follow my lead. If you cannot keep up, then you will not survive. And that will be the end of it. Jack stared after her for a moment, watching as she stood tall and confident, her silhouette framed by the firelight. There was no question about it. Nara was not like anyone he had ever met. She was ruthless, calculating, and completely unapologetic. She didn't play by the same rules. She didn't need to. He wasn't sure if he was ready for this, for whatever strange and intense dynamic she was setting up between them, but one thing was certain, he had no choice. He was already in too deep. So what now? Jack asked, standing up slowly and brushing the sand from his clothes. What's the next step in your little survival school? Nara turned to face him, her eyes scanning him with a level of scrutiny that made him feel exposed. The next step, she said, her voice carrying a hint of something dark and dangerous, is for you to learn that survival is not just about the body. It is about the mind. And more importantly, it is about understanding your place in the world. Jack blinked, unsure of what she meant by that. My place in the world? Nara's gaze softened ever so slightly, but there was still a fire in her eyes. Yes. You are here because you have a purpose. It may not be clear to you yet, but I see it. And when you are ready, you will understand. But for now, you must trust me. Jack didn't know what to say to that. He wanted to ask more questions, to try to make sense of everything, but he couldn't find the words. He was tired, physically, emotionally, mentally. He felt like he was on the verge of something big, something life-changing, but he wasn't sure if he was ready for it. All right, he finally said, his voice quiet but resolute. I'll trust you. For now. Nara nodded, as though that was all she had been waiting for. Good. Then we will begin. Jack could only nod in return, the weight of her words settling over him. Whatever came next, he knew it wasn't going to be easy. But if he was going to survive, if he was going to make it off this alien planet, he would have to follow her. And somewhere deep down, he realized he wasn't just following her out of necessity. He was following her because he couldn't resist the pull she had on him, because, for better or worse, he was already starting to feel connected to her in ways he hadn't anticipated. This was just the beginning.